What is going on, everybody? Thank you for coming to another wonderful episode of the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. We are here to provide you with some opinions, some information, some insight, and we are actually starting a new series called In Defense of Liberty. This series is essentially going to cover different ways and means that you can get involved to help defend liberty, to make a difference in your communities, in your states, and just be a difference as an individual. And I think that there's a lot of conversations that we can have. And I am super, super excited to have my guest here. He's a good friend of mine. Blake, you want to kind of exposition dump and tell everybody what you're about and maybe even what you do?
Yeah, sure. My name is Blake. I suppose first and foremost, I'm a family man. Recently had a child a year ago and got another one on the way actually this summer. I live in northern Minnesota with my wife, and we absolutely love it up here. Well, love a lot of parts of it up here, let's put it that way. And by trade, I gunsmith. So if you guys maybe have caught us on some other channels that Jeremy's been on before, we've kind of talked about that sort of stuff ad nauseum. But tonight, I suppose is going to be kind of fun. I'm really looking forward to it, actually. It'll be interesting to see where this conversation goes. And I'm actually sitting outside right now on the phone, so if it gets a little shaky, I apologize about that. But it's just so beautiful. It's like I think it was 71 degrees on my thermometer I saw earlier today. And I figured might as well enjoy the outdoors while we're having a good conversation.
Absolutely, dude. Well, hey, I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to come on here and talk about some pretty fundamental items when it comes to defending liberty and the best ways that we are able to augment that and use that, at our disposal. And I think the crux of this conversation really is going to be coming down to the individual, what we can do in our own homes, but also what we can do in our community, which eventually translates into the state. Before we get to that, I just want to hit a little bit of housekeeping. This is going to be a series I'm going to mix into my regular programming every so often. It might be a once or twice a month thing. We'll see how it kind of goes. And I am still planning on having, in addition to this new series on how we can promote bills and legislation, how you can go about drafting those, getting them into the flow of everything, and hopefully making a difference in your states and in your communities. So stay tuned for that. I'm trying to organize it, but it's taken a little bit of work and a little bit of coordination. And then on the comment section, great to see Centerline Systems here. Learn me something. Absolutely pumped to have you guys here. Thank you for stopping in and giving us a little bit of your time. So without further ado, Blake, you and I think over the several years at this point, I can't even believe it's been that long, but over the years, we've talked about a variety of different ways that, liberty can be defended. And we always seem to come back to the conversation of what the individual can do and what we can do within our communities, and how a strong community can really augment that defense, and how it creates that realm of freedom and liberty that our founders talked about. And there's one quote that I want to tee you off with, and then I'll let you take it. But it is, let's see here. So the founders had a lot of fantastic quotes, but they have several as it pertains to guarding virtue and freedom. And there's two in particular that really tend to stand out to me. One of them I'll read is by Benjamin Franklin, and it goes, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have a more need of masters." And I think that rings true, and I hope that we'll be able to expand into that particular conversation as we go. And then there's one more. Actually, there's two more. There's another one by John Adams that says, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to govern to the government of any other." That one was by John Adams. And then one final one. It's more about preserving the principles, but it was by Daniel Webster. And most people who don't realize Webster at the time was very, very young. He was younger than most of the other revolutionaries of the time. And I believe he wrote his first dictionary in his teens only. He was a very bright young individual. But he has a quote that goes, "It is hardly too strong to say that the Constitution was made to guard the people against the dangers of good intentions. There are men in all ages who mean to govern well, but they mean to govern. They promise to be kind masters, but they mean to be masters. They think there need be but little restraint upon themselves. The love of power may sink too deep into their own hearts." And when I think about these quotes, and then I think about like, okay, they gave us a lot of warnings, they gave us much wisdom, but they were really big on community, because community can be a bulwark in preserving moral and virtue, in preserving the balance of power. And Blake, I'm going to send it to you. What are your feelings, or what is your take on those quotes in particular? How do they intertwine themselves at the community level and at an individual level?
Well, I think at the core of what they're talking about is really how human interactions really kind of work on that, like you said, on the community level. Specifically, Webster quote, I've never heard that one before, is really interesting.
Yeah.
And there's a valid point about that. And to that one in particular, community also has accountability to it.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that's very important in a healthy society that's actually going to be able to move forward and bring up more generations that have like-minded principles.
Sure.
So I would say, honestly, when it comes down to it, the biggest thing, the most important thing in life is, first off, God, in my opinion. Then it's your family. Then it's your nation. And in the sense of what we're talking about today, the nation would be that ethos that combines us, that common fabric that runs through all of us. Well, that used to. It's kind of having a little bit of issues right now. And one of the reasons that personally I am looking more towards a community level, and I think that is can be your nation to a sense. I live in a very, very small town up here in northern Minnesota. I think our population is 900 in the off season. You got to go 45 minutes any direction to get to a Walmart. And honestly, it's kind of the way I like it. But in the wintertime, you have to rely on people, like people you maybe don't know, but people that you do know in a lot of cases. And that fabric that holds us together, especially in cases where you could die because of the elements, is one of the very, very strong cornerstones of a healthy, rich community. I think the founders, though, really understood that. And I think that because it comes from a time period in history where if you weren't a more cohesive unit, if you weren't all firing on the same cylinder, understanding the same goal, moving towards that, death was a very, very real possibility. And over the last 150 years, we've done a lot to eliminate that. But in the situations that we have going on right now with the world turmoil, the events that we see unfolding, and both through political strife, war, potential for natural disaster, etc. Pick your poison, whatever you want to kind of put a pin on to make this kind of a comfortable concept, is that there is a change that's kind of taking place right now. And it does seem like, things are getting a little harder. And to prepare for what's coming, I do think that community, especially the one that used to exist back in the founding age, where people were colonizing and they were going to new lands and we were trying to eke out a living in unfamiliar terrain, that was something that held people together. And then they built civilization on that, built societies on that actually really have lasted a long time. But now I'm kind of bloviating, so let's go ahead and turn that over to you, Jeremy. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's, and I think you bring up several good points. I mean, because it all really does stem back to community, and community, with a solid community, you increase your chances of survival. You do have that accountability aspect, especially if you keep it somewhat tight knit. It's like, the person that lives down the road, the person that owns the shop, the person that sits on the city council or the town council, the people in the fire department. And so as a result, there is a tendency to be this realm of like kind of being your brother's keeper to some degree. And in saying that, I think it's pretty conducive to liberty and preserving liberty, because if you're helping everybody and you're keeping everybody accountable, then it mitigates. It doesn't eliminate, and I think that's a big misnomer for some people. It mitigates the potential for people to violate rights, to violate liberty, to get into these overarching positions to where they start to abuse their power, because you have this tight-knit sense of community. And one area that I really kind of want to run down, and I think you might appreciate this, but we've also talked about kind of the economy, but not in a I think like an elaborate sense, but a very community oriented sense. And what's happening with the economy and what has been happening with the economy for quite some time is pretty suboptimal. And we're starting to see states go to back to creating gold certificates and silver certificates to have a secondary way of trading and being able to do business. And I think, when you have a community that's conducive, that isn't dependent on the federal government, that's not even dependent on the state, if you will, but they're self-sufficient and they're capable of having free trade, true free markets, having a good functional currency or ability to have good economy, I think it really helps augment liberty, and it keeps you away from any of like that, or has the potential to keep you away from any of the overarching kind of tyrannical dispositions that we see. And so one of those things, and I think it was you that I was talking to before this, just something as simple as gardening. Gardening is one of those things to where it doesn't have to be elaborate, just enough to support yourself. But what it does is it creates a mechanism to where it might not be much, but it's a little bit less dependent on a system, which in turn helps break you away from a potentially bad economy, and you're not at the behest of the system in its entirety. You are still in many other cases, but I think you get where I'm going with this. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing is, so gardening is but a small thing, and I'm a firm believer that everybody really should at least grow something. I mean, try it. Like, even if you're not interested in starting out like with a garden where you're hoping to actually get food out of it, like even if it's a house plant, like start to learn how to nurture these living things and make them grow well. Because even if you don't have the time to right now, and you may have the time for one plant, it's going to teach you skills that might save your life one day, and it's going to help you start to understand how these things work. So first off, because again, we've seen egg price fluctuation, milk price fluctuation, commodity shortages in certain examples. We're starting to see things ratchet up a little more again. Prices for stuff is outrageous right now. So anything you can do again to augment your nutritional intake is going to be huge. But when you have like-minded people around you that you encourage to do these things, and they encourage you to do these things, maybe I'm growing a bunch of tomatoes and potatoes, through something that's actually, you should look it up. It's called a pomato. That's where you graft a potato plant root set to a tomato plant top. It takes a little extra work in the start, but they actually get hybrid vigor and outproduce on both levels. So a fantastic way to increase your nutrition in a single area. But let's say that's what my garden's focused in. But my buddy down the road doesn't even have to be my direct neighbor. He could be a couple miles away, because we do have modern transportation at this point. He's growing a whole bunch of beans, and he's growing a whole bunch of squash, which are super shelf stable. All right. So that's something that I can trade now with him. And you can see where this can expand beyond it. So because we can't all do everything, but a lot of us together can augment each other's skills, and we can all do a lot of things. And I mean, I think it's, and don't quote me on this, but it's like 25 unique food groups is kind of required for civilization and in a tribal society to kind of be able to held together, have a healthy diet, and be able to expand, populate, etc. So if you can all be doing something like that, that's great. And there's a lot of very primitive ways to do it, but you can also incorporate technology to it. So knowing somebody that has the understanding of some base programming, the ability to install hardware that maybe even is to some levels robotics and automation, so that you can increase food production in a smaller footprint. So again, this kind of expands out, but the only way it expands out is with a community. and the more tight knit your community is, all right, the more you can trade internally, which in essence means a few things. Your labor stays internal, meaning everybody's helping build. Your money, it stays more internal, which means everybody can grow a little more. We're not paying as many taxes. We're not doing this. We're not doing that, because we're straight up trading across for goods. And it's one of those things that if you have on a small scale, and throughout history has been proven on a small scale, this works wonders, but once a tribe gets too big, what did it used to do in history? It would split and go off and create a new tribe, or it becomes an empire bloated with bureaucracy. And after about 250 years, it collapses, and I think that what we're kind of seeing right now in our current time frame is that the system is fragile. Something's changing. Certain government or non-government entities would just call it the fourth turning, but what we're seeing take place right now, nobody really knows what the outcome is going to be. But there's a lot of vested interest groups, both governmental, non-governmental, private military. I mean, the list goes on and on and on for vested interest groups that are all going to try to probably make some plays, try to get their hand in this new world, because we know everything's changing, but everything's kind of in flux. It's me and Mark like to say over on Centerline, and Millstone is in the churn, if you will. And because of that, I think what's going to happen to a certain extent is you will see people kind of build these modern day arcs, if you will, which are going to be closer, tight knit communities. You could call them tribes or clans or whatever you want to, if you want to use an archaic term, and of people pulling together and trying to create a holdfast to weather whatever is to come. Now, I don't know what that is. It could literally just be as simple as new technology comes out. As simple, I say, and a new world order, in the sense of it's like every previous one before happens, and it's a realignment of world powers, realignment of borders and things along those lines. It could be something that's natural, but at the very least, even if nothing of this sort happens, simply because of how in flux the economy is, how tight things are getting for the average person, it's just a smart move to start to develop these networks. And they start small. It's your family, maybe a couple neighbors, a few friends, you kind of start to, expand that idea out to them. They do it to the friends, grows slowly, but it's way better to know a few people, because you can't do it by yourself. Even in a stable world, you can't do it by yourself.
Right. Yeah. And I, there's a lot of good points there. And I think the general theme also of being able to be self-sustainable, not only as an individual, but as a community. And I think one of the big portions of that is, again, having enough internalized to where you can get along, even if something does happen. And I've impressed, especially on like younger laborers, because I've worked around a lot of younger guys who get into the trades or laborers and, labor construction, stuff like that. And, I always tell them, like, look, like, this isn't bad, but you should definitely figure out something you can be good at, because it becomes a commodity down the road that eventually you can trade. You can determine the value of what it is that you want. Obviously, there's nuance to that, of course, but it's like, you now have something that economically is of value, and that makes you inherently more valuable as a person. And it makes you it puts you in a unique position to where if things become even more undesirable, you have the ability to trade a skill set or a good or something of that nature to be able to continue to hopefully feed your family and create at least a foundation within your community, to where it promotes liberty, and it doesn't lend itself to this realm of just absolute chaos, because everything is just shattering and falling apart. It's like a glue or an adhesive that holds everything together. And I don't know if this is necessarily the best thing, but I do believe that to some degree people should, at least for one item, maybe two items, niche out into something, really invest yourself into it, so that way you have something to market. Nowadays, I feel like there's very much a push in like trying to be really good at everything, and all you really get is just like, you're okay at it, and it's like, if you have somebody that is really, really good, say, at diesel mechanics, versus a person who's generally good at certain things. And maybe they do know diesel mechanics. Who are you going to go to? You're probably going to go to the guy that niched out in diesel mechanics because you feel with confidence that he's going to be able to do a far better job on your tractor or whatever the case is. And it's nothing against the other guy, but
right.
that's the
I've actually,
market.
yeah, for sure. And it's funny you bring up a diesel mechanic. I've actually got a black thumb that's like that, and he's a wizard with diesels. He's not in the
Dope.
state here, but like, there's nobody. If I was gonna do a freak rig, it would be him, because there's no one that knows how to breathe life into units like that than better than he does. But to that point, these are the things that build a community. Again, it's that specialized, like, and in a modern society. You know, you're right. A lot of people do. They want to be a little jack of all trades. And there's nothing wrong with being a jack of all trades. In a lot of ways, I kind of am. But the specialization is absolutely imperative, because those are the things that are going to allow you to maintain knowledge. And this is one of my greatest concerns of really the situation we find ourselves in. Technology is amazing. I recently, for the first time, have started actually using some AI to, well, quote unquote AI, language models, I should say, to assist me in searching things and actually developing some lists that I need, etc. And specifically Gemini 2.5 on AI Google Studios. And it's incredibly powerful to the point where right now, amazing that it's free. But it's obviously free because we're feeding it information to train the future models. And where we're going with this is because I can already see, because I've had the thing recheck itself and find problems constantly, and I can check it too and find problems, is the dumbing down of information. We're going to become more and more reliant on the technology that we utilize to the point where we're not going to question it. I was watching a cooking video the other day, and it was the history of buffalo wings or deviled wings with Tasting History with Max Miller. Great channel, actually. I think that's his name. And he goes through the history of how it was founded, and then actually points out that Google has it wrong. But because Google says it, everyone's going to say that's right. You know what I mean? So that is only going to get worse. How do we maintain that? How do we safeguard against that happening, that information loss? Is by having experts. It's by having people that specialize in a trade, whether it's carpentry or auto mechanics and diesel tech. Maybe it machinists, or maybe it's a seamstress, or textile industries in general. It's not that those things are to be relegated to history, because if we lose those skills, we lose our past. And if you look at history as a ladder, for instance, every rung of that ladder has been built by a previous generation. And depending on how solidly that's been built, those are kind of your catches. If your ladder of civilization, that rung you're building breaks, well, hopefully that previous civilization or that previous ladder rung has been maintained and that information's still there so you can pick it up. So if we break from this modern level right now, are we going to fall towards the Western expansion level, or are we going to keep going down to the stone bottom? And that's kind of the thing. So if we lose that information that's been accrued from generations and generations, thousands and thousands of years of very brilliant people that have come before us. And that's one of the things that drives me crazy about our modern society. We think our ancestors, those that came before us, are less intelligent than us because we've achieved this great little black mirror that we're staring into right now to talk to each other. I mean, the hubris in that statement. But if we lose that information, if we do fall, we fall really, really, really hard. So again, this is why community is important. It safeguards against this. Maybe only in a little blip of society if things get really bad in one little area of the earth. But that spark can carry us forward. And that's, if you look again through history, when we've had these collapses happen, and trust me, there's been a lot of them. If you really want to dig into it, we fall a lot. I mean, I think there's been 4 recognized bottleneck events where humanity probably should have gone extinct and we didn't in the genetic record alone. But if we look at that, what happens when one of those collapses takes place? Well, the empires break apart, or whatever catastrophe drives people apart, and they go again to tribes. They go into these small groups that can rely on each other, where the most valuable commodity isn't some greenbacks or gold, it's the price of your labor and the work you're willing to put in and trade. And again, I think that's why, even though it's one of the more archaic forms of humanity, it's our base setting. And it's one of the most important ones to embrace, even in a high technology society that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's I think that's really well stated. And there's obviously a lot that really goes into it, but I think you made a lot of really good points, especially branching off of the fact that it's not a bad thing to niche out. It's not a bad thing to have specialties, but in saying that also, um, doing that, having a niche or having a specialty really actually does a lot to preserve and promote advancement as opposed to negate from it. And I think there was a conventional wisdom to where it's like, well, if we're not, like, for instance, if you look at colleges, they we had schools at one point that were really about like that niche, driving that niche, getting these people to be as good of doctors as they can, to be as good of perhaps attorneys, as much as it begrudges me to even bring attorneys in legal representation. No offense to anybody who does that, but if you know, you know. Or something that's more of a specialization. They really had a sense of there's really a sense of merit when you used to graduate from a college or a university. There was a lot of merit behind that because you actually knew a lot of what you're talking about because they made you niche out into stuff like that, so you got to be really effective. Now it's more, and you even see this through like grade school going into high school, to where it's like, you need to know science, you need to know this, you need to know that, you need to know this. And it's less about actually being able to function in life. And it's more about like, you need to learn everything that has nothing to do with anything, even though some people are like, oh, well, science. But my point is it used to be very structured and there used to be a reason for all of it. Now it's just like, we want you to learn all of the things. And what you're finding, especially, and this is maybe this is my argument for why, again, while the federal government was never allocated the ability to oversee education, it was something that was typically left to the communities and the states constitutionally anyways. But my argument is ever since it got relegated to the federal government, we've only seen any of these scores or any of these markers ever go downhill. And if we look at where we are today, the ability of educate, or the outcome rather of education as it pertains to a national level, is just horrible. I mean, we have some of the lowest scores ever in our existence as a country. And when you go back, say even like 100 years, and you look at the scores and you compare the scores, first off, the way that they scored things was granted somewhat different, but the average intellect, the IQ of an average individual was much higher. They were much more competent. They were much more capable of understanding the fundamentals of a subject. Nowadays, we have people that can barely write their own names. And to me, that's immensely problematic because it became more about serving the system and less about creating a foundation of a society. And educationally, we have failed not only our youth, but we failed ourselves, So there's a huge component to niching out, but there's also a huge byproduct of the education too.
Well, I mean, if we want to go down that path real briefly,
please do.
That's the thing. I don't necessarily think, I mean, in the eyes of us, in the eyes of the civilian, in the eyes of the citizens, it absolutely has been a failure. But I think that there might be a malevolent side to it where it actually wasn't a failure. It's exactly as it was designed.
For sure. Yeah.
To me, it seems very much so that the education system is train them just to be smart enough to do the task, but not smart enough to ask why.
Sure.
And, there was a time in our nation and throughout history, we've seen blips of this take place where when you went to school, when you were to be educated, you weren't educated to be a slave. You were educated to be a weapon, a thorn, a problem, a free thinker, a liberty-minded individual, a actual, true, total person. And that's been ripped out of the education system slowly, almost as if it was just bloodletting it over a massive period of time, over 100 years, 150 years. And I think that, again, this is one of the safeguards against those sorts of situations in these small communities, especially if those communities you start to develop are that of a young family set where they have children, is look into maybe even building a schoolhouse, hiring a teacher, that all the families agree upon, and doing an old school style schoolhouse. And then once the kids
Sure.
get to a certain age, this is where I don't even know if legally you can do this anymore, but an apprenticeship. You get to 14, you
Yep.
go into an apprenticeship,
Mm-hmm.
and you can build a very brilliant mind at a young age if you nurture and foster curiosity with proper information input. That's the thing is, you think about it, grade school, you beat the curiosity out of a child.
Sure.
You fit them in a box and you tell them this is exactly have to be. And now, to a certain extent, you need to have a child behave, but in the same extent, you can't, you know, take their entire curiosity away from the world. And if you foster that love of knowledge properly in a young age, they're going to seek it themselves.
Sure.
So they'll learn more by the time they're 14 than most kids, and I use the word kids, 25-year-olds that are getting out of college, because they actually crave that knowledge. They crave that information. They want to understand the mechanics of the world around them. Because once you can understand, even to the base level that humanity understands the mechanics of the universe, you can manipulate them. And if you
Yeah.
foster that at a young age, I mean, my gosh, the potential is limitless. And that's what terrifies the powers that be. And that's why what we're talking about is even such a taboo subject, because we're
Yeah.
talking about the base setting of humanity, not the layers of programming that have been put on top of it. And you get back down to really what we are. We are animals. We absolutely are, but we're thinking animals that are tool users. And an unleashed mind that's truly allowed to explore and truly allowed to develop its intelligence is a very, very powerful weapon against, well, any totalitarian system.
Sure. Yeah. There's, when we look at all the different facets that are involved in a community, I mean, whether it's education, whether it's a profession, whether it's an, an economic advantage as it pertains to internal trading. I mean, these all really are things that are essential to survive. I mean, if we're not teaching each other, we're working to try and produce something that's worth, our time or our products, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, all of this, again, we're just making points and we're identifying different markers of what supports and what does not support liberty. And at the core foundation of it, liberty is the essential building block of what our country was founded on. And it was so essential that, our founders basically created the best document that they possibly could in hopes that it was going to further support liberty. But they weren't ignorant. They understood that we had to be a mature society that had virtue, that had morals, that had education, that had experience that we would bring with us, and that fundamentally we were the keepers of our own liberty, of our own rights, and all of these things. This is going to maybe take it into the same direction or slightly different, but when we look at the things that are contrary to this, so when we look at things that become destructive, one could still argue that these ideas and these notions that are antithetical to liberty, and I'm not speaking just solely about the United States, but I think in general around the world, is those things too also are fermented from a small community, from a tight-knit community, because one person has a thought and they're like, well, but what if we didn't do this? What if we did it somewhat different? And so as simple as it is, or rather as intricate as it might be, depending, for us to really create an effective bulwark for liberty, there's also the caveat or the flip side of that, where there is also the potential for a smaller community to have a contrarian idea against liberty and say, well, we're not going to take it all the way away, but we think society might be better if we take some of these things away. And i.e. democracy. A reason that we weren't a democracy, because our founders fundamentally understood what total democracy was, which is why we were a republic and I'm actually, and I'll give it to you here in a second, but I'm reading through a book by Ron Paul, which is it's talking about essentially 50 different issues that affect freedom. It's liberty defined, 50 issues that affect freedom. And as he's going through these different issues, you know, he had kind of talked about how Rome fell and how all these things ended up taking, taking their seats in history. And it's very interesting how it still started with one guy. You know, Caesar got this really crazy idea and was like, you know what? I have this really crazy idea. I'm just going to go and I'm going to go into Rome. I'm going to cross the Rubicon and I'm going to try and seize power. Now, granted, that's a very simplified version of it, but essentially he crossed the Rubicon. That's where we get that, you know, that saying from, crossing the Rubicon, right? Because once it happened, there's really no going back after that. And that was when the Republic of Rome fell and it became an empire. And again, it all started from a separate community and ended up in Rome. Or it's the same thing here, where all it took was a separate community to come about in the United States or wherever it might be. I mean, if you look at Germany, you know, Nazism did not occur overnight. You know, communism and the Soviet style did not occur overnight. It started as a small community, gained power, and got traction, and eventually took things over. So again, whether it's good or bad, it all starts in a community.
Well, and I think that, like you were saying, is on the opposing side, you know, if you want to boil it down to as simple as, which I think it is good versus evil, or the light versus the dark, if you will, everything starts on that micro scale. We don't know the ripples of our actions throughout history. We really don't. I mean, something very simple can have massive consequences. And to that point, if you again look through the historical record, typically it does start on these small scales, these small groups of people that are devoted to whatever cause they may well have and can enact upon it, rather. But let's look again too at, I mean, it's prescient to this day, but Rome. Why is Rome the eternal nation? You know, why was it a 1,000-year run? Well, it's because it went through multiple iterations. When it was first founded, the 7 cities, or the 7 hills in the city in Rome, and it united the peninsula in Italy. It was, like you said, it was a republic. When Caesar seized the throne, when he marched across the Rubicon into the Gaul territory to start taking things over, he created an empire at that point. That was the death of the republic, but it continued the idea of Rome. And I think that, you know, we can go into the Byzantine era and the East and the West Roman Empire, but that's beside the point of the conversation we're having right now. If you look at it to the sense of America, well, the Republic stage, as much as it pains to say me, is probably dead. I would love to see a rebirth of the Republic. I really would like a phoenix rising from the ashes. I would love to see that happen. But if we're being honest and pragmatic to the situation that's at hand right now, the odds are we're probably moving to an empire. Whether it's with this current era or in the next, you know, couple lifetimes, if we are to survive as a nation, we probably become a true empire. It's just kind of how history is. You can see it in a lot of different nations throughout time. So again, is how do you protect against that? Well, when the Roman Empire truly fell and it broke into the East and the Western Roman Empire, or the East and the West Empire, you know, you saw communities start to set up in the bones of the previous structures that were there. They weathered the storm of the barbarian raids and the food rioting and the just general civil war and massacres that take place when these sorts of things happen. You know, it's not like this is an uncommon thing in history, and we've become so desensitized to human nature. And there's a lot of bad human nature and a lot of good human nature, and that's something that you always have to keep in mind. But we've become so desensitized to what history is that we think, oh, we've risen so far, it can't happen to us. Well, Rome may not have died in a day. You know, it definitely wasn't built in a day. But it was a slow, anguishing death over 1,000 years, well, about 700 years or so. And to that point, people weathered that storm. And they did it through communities, knowing each other, helping each other out, and they did keep fragments
Mhm.
of technology and moved it forward. I'm not saying that's what we're going through, but boy, that is kind of how history is. It doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes, as it were.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting talking about the American Empire, and there are a lot of people that have gone back and evaluated, um, the United States, and it is suggested that the American Empire started shortly after World War II, after the United States came off of their high, essentially, of
Mm-hmm.
winning a war. We had just dropped two nuclear weapons. We almost we had almost dropped a third. They already had a third in line, but
Mm-hmm.
we never did. And that was like down to the wire. Like they were almost ready to drop that one. And you also ended up with the creation of like the military industrial complex, which really drove home that empire. And in listening to that was part of one of the chapters in Ron Paul's book, um, Liberty Defined, which he's like, what does every empire have? Well, they have a very militaristic orientation. That's how empires come about. And when you look at what happened after Julius Caesar, they became a very militaristic society, very military conquesting society.
A
And
professional army.
yes, and it's amazing because when you look at these types of things, it almost seems like while an empire does come about, it almost always seems that the death throes come after perpetual military conflict. Like they just don't know when it's enough. And eventually the nation itself cannot withstand it, and it crumbles under its own weight despite having one of the most effective militaries in the world. And it's quite amazing. I'm a big pattern person. And when you start to look at the patterns through history, and when you start to look at what empires become, it's empires can last a long time, but usually the crash is either it fizzles out right away, or it's a very loud, screeching, gurgling death to the end, and it tends to be very chaotic. There's no like real in between, and I can't help but to think that like post World War II, like we just had this ramping up of the military industrial complex, this behemoth of a state that eventually ended up into, as Michael Bolden calls it, the monster state. We live under the largest government in the world ever, and I think we've been an empire for a very long time. When the interest started shifting towards conquest and getting involved militarily in more things than we had any constitutional ability to do, and we started making other people's interests our own, and less about our interests being focused on the American people, preserving liberty and preserving and defending the rights of our people. And I think, again, we're talking about community. So where does community come into that? Well, community is still the prevailing thing, where if you can begin to preserve liberty through distancing yourself from this behemoth, you're going to find that liberty can exist. It's going to be very small. It might be a pocket, but it still can exist. And that's ultimately the jumping or the springboard point in which you can start to spread it again. But I do want to say, to your point, before I relent my position here, I don't think, and I really hope I'm wrong. I don't think that when we start to see liberty return to a scale or a metric that's worth noticing, I don't think we're going to be. I don't really think it's going to be 50 United States. I really don't. I think there's a divide that's too great at this juncture. And like I said, I hope I'm really wrong, but I think it's going to become microcosms of states together. So like balkanization, or it's going to be something even smaller than that. And I yield the floor. And then after you respond, there's something in particular that I would really like to put towards you, that I think you can speak on a little bit more personally. But
Sure.
anyways.
Well, I mean, I would like to say what you painted was the worst case scenario, and I don't think it is. but I do
Nor do
think
I.
it's probably one of the more likely scenarios. And that's the problem. We're trying to look in a crystal ball. We don't have all the answers. Shoot, we're working on fragments of data, like basically scrolls that have kind of evaporated away when they were first discovered, and we're trying to read the little tidbits here and there to predict the future. But if that is what happens, then again, it goes back to a community is beyond important if you want to try to have a chance to survive, or your family to have the best chance to survive possible. Again, in these situations of balkanization, it doesn't mean that there will be nothing available. There's nothing
Oh,
there. There's
sure.
no
Yep.
industry or anything. These things still kind of go on, as it were. I just realized my ground's a little soft. My chair was really sinking into the ground and about to fall over. Anyway,
Don't build a community off of soft ground. That's all I'm.
yes. Make sure you have a nice foundation.
Yes.
But back to that point is that's why it's so stinking important to know people, to have people you can trust, you can rely on, have a little bit of a stockpile of some essential things, especially if your family needs medicines of certain kinds. Sure. Have some new extra nutrition, and you don't have to go crazy with it. You don't have to be full on prepper mode, but be prepared and have a few things that, if things get really bad, you can trade them off. Might be the difference of saving your life. I can remember on an individual level, my father once told me, he goes, if you're ever traveling abroad, you always want to make sure you have about $2,000 in cash. You want to have a watch that you can hawk for a plane ticket out of there, and your passport. And if you have those three things, you can pretty much navigate anywhere you need to if you absolutely have to. But to that level, it's that concept of a safeguard, a system in place where you have something, at least, even if it's very minuscule, a safety net of some kind that can help you better weather a storm. And, things are so in flux right now. Let's say this balkanization situation actually happens. All right. If it were to happen, it would happen relatively fast, in the sense of major changes would be taking place in the local level, in your economy, in good transportation. You'd see a breakdown in the framework of society, if you will. And in those flux time periods, before things kind of settle out, by the tremors, if you were, it's very important to be able to have at least enough of stable head and some supplies that you can weather that storm. Who knows how long that lasts? Who knows how bad things get? Again, the good thing is, very few times in history do we have records of things getting so bad it's like straight up apocalypse level, but it's possible, and it's not something to be scared of. It's the ebbs and flows of history, my man.
Right. Yeah. And I'd like to add a little bit of flavor real quick before I push on to the next point here. But when I consider balkanization, I think when we study it and see what happened in Central and Eastern Europe with with Yugoslavia, actually, in particular, it's definitely not the method that I would like. It's often very bloody, very chaotic, very violent, more so, and it tends to be relatively sustained for well over a decade, as we had seen, and it's not optimal. And I've seen people kind of advocate for this, and I haven't seen it as much of late. So maybe they kind of figured out that maybe it's not the best way to solve problems, but it is one of those things that I think is fairly likely. And when you look at how countries have been created over time, it typically comes at, in the realm of balkanization. Usually it's a bigger country that's split up. They all become their own little satellites, and they do the things that they want to do. But in that, I don't think it's the most optimal thing. I do think that to some degree that is one of those situations, and I think there's many others where having a good community can also stem or mitigate the chaos to some degree. And that's where I bring it from, not just your towns or your immediate communities, but if you have a strong state, if you have a state that you can work with and that you can help kind of become a bastion for the people that exist there, it's going to weather that storm a lot better than even some of your neighbors or whatever the case is. But
God help us in Minnesota then.
Yeah, right. And so, but to that point though, like, the reality of it is like there are people, and this is where I think people need to really have some introspection and make um, considerations, because each person is a little bit different. You have to figure out what is best for you and what is best for your family. And you have, so this, and I kind of want to fold this into, um, what we're going to talk about. But for each person, that's something different, and what's best for you and what's best for your family is not going to be the same for the next person. And so
Mhm.
nobody should, nobody's going to, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but it shouldn't be held against you to make that decision and go to someplace better if you reasonably believe that that's going to be
Mhm.
the better place for you. And if you're going to stay, then you accept the consequences and all the things that come with that. But in the end of the day, if you're not doing something to better your situation and then be able to work into that community and help better that community, then you're kind of doing yourself a disservice, in my humble opinion. And now, that being said, I think you bring a really unique perspective, and I explained this to you before we started. You know, you're a father, you're a business owner, and these are two. These can be two very rewarding things and two very chaotic things. But in the end of the day, I think it gives you a unique look on liberty and how liberty is important and how a community supports these things. Because you know no offense to anybody that doesn't have children. I don't have children, and there's other people that may or may not watch this that don't have children. But being a father provides a very unique perspective that until you have children, you're not going to realize certain things that you have, certain things that you don't have, and certain areas that you are or willing or not willing to compromise on for the sake of your children and for your family. And so, and I think liberty is no less one of those subjects. And that factors very much into a business owner perspective. So if you would, I would absolutely love for you to elaborate on that and kind of give your insight and your perspective in how perhaps things have changed as it pertains to community, how things have maybe been reinforced, and what liberty means to you now, that you're a father, but also what may have changed when you started your business. So if you would, please.
Sure. Well, you hit it on the head. So for those of you that don't know, I don't really talk about it in great specific nature, I suppose, online.
Mm.
But my son just turned a year a little while ago, so I'm a very young father, in the sense of young as in having kids, not necessarily quite as young as I should be having kids.
Yeah.
But anyway, the second he came into this world, my entire perspective did change. I didn't understand how radically it would.
Yeah.
I can remember my parents always telling me, you'll understand one day when you have your own children. And for a long time in my life, I'm going to get a little personal here. I thought I shouldn't have children. That was in
Mm.
my younger days when I was,
Yeah.
teens into early 20s, because well, that was what was told when we were growing up all the time. Oh gosh, the world's ending, you don't want to bring a child into this world, yada yada yada. And it wasn't until my mid 20s I kind of started realizing, really what it meant to be who I've turned into now.
Mhm.
Freedom based individual that's I guess in some ways is kind of, I don't want to use the term radicalized, but has become very aware of what the world really is, and how it's tried to pervert that of individual liberty and freedom, and try to
Sure.
make us all cogs, if you want to put a number to it. And then it
Yeah.
wasn't until a few years ago I realized that if you truly want to change that system, you have to bring the next generation up right.
Yes.
And when my child came into the world, it was another one of those major changes in my life. And since then, everything's different. And it's all for the good. I mean, I love
Yeah.
every single aspect of being a father, but my concerns are different in the sense that I'm no longer living for myself and my wife. I'm living for this tiny life that's completely helpless to the elements and to the ability
Sure.
to take care of itself. So, I'm worried about the future more so now because of that. In the sense of the business side of things, for those of you that don't know, I'm a gunsmith. I went to school back in 2011 for it, and I've been operating a gun shop since about 2012, 2013 in northern Minnesota. And, you know, well, quite frankly, it's kind of hard to navigate that world of regulation and those sorts of things. And you want to talk about liberty in my industry? Well, there isn't any. We are quite literally
Well
by
said.
law, quite literally by law, we
Yeah.
are indentured servants because we have to, under penalty of imprisonment, maintain a record that has to be kept in perpetuity for as long as our business is open. And then at that point, those records need to be forfeited to the federal government via the ATF. And if we do not maintain those records, and oh Lord help me, trust me, we do, we can face prison time. And that's forced labor, you know? So liberty in the entire industry that's set up around the Second Amendment does not exist.
Wild,
You
isn't
know,
it?
oh boy, yeah, it really is kind of crazy, you know?
Yeah.
And to that point, we're seeing some real changes starting to take place on that level, and for the positive for the most part. You know, I'm happy to say that in the case of like suppressors, I have clients now getting them back within a week. And what's really interesting about that is when we would get the paperwork back, it used to be signed by somebody's name as far as the approval goes. And now, as of about a month ago, to my understanding, and from what we're seeing, is they're rubber stamping them. Just boom, it's approved, it's approved. There's no one's name on it.
I've heard that too. Yep.
Yeah. And what it seems to me, if I'm reading between the lines here, is oh crap, our money circuit is going to be turned off here pretty quick. So let's get as many of these out as we can before we aren't going to get cash for this anymore. So I do think we're seeing some positive changes take place as far as the quote unquote liberty side of my industry goes. Maybe a little bit of a revival of the Second Amendment actually being represented as it is intended to. But going to tie those two things together, specifically the protection of my family and since I'm in this industry using these sorts of tools, is going out in public anymore. This world's changed, you know, and I do see it differently now that I'm a father. But cities are not a place that I would want to bring my family to anymore. I don't care what city it is. It could be the nicest city in the United States. Like, there are too many variables that no longer can I calculate in that environment where I feel safe in any way, shape, or form. Even small towns of certain areas are getting that way. So like this, the mindset's changing. You remember, and I know a lot of the people that here are listening probably know Mark from Centerline Systems. I've talked to him for years about this, but when the pandemic happened back in 2019, we had a thing that we used to say: one of two things are going to happen. The nice are going to get nicer, and the ornery are going to get ornerier. And since that time, we're over a half decade now, that turning of an age. Because if you talk to anybody about, the pandemic, what do they say? Oh, before and after. Okay, well, when civilization refers to something as before and after, you can very firmly say that, hey, we just went through a turning of an age. Something changed. Something has laid a scar upon the earth and all of its people that will remain in our collective consciousness for generations to come. And when those things happen, the world changes. So if you go out in the world now, well, the nice have gotten nicer, and that's pretty true. But the ornerier have gotten a lot ornerier. And, you know, from the side of that situational awareness and paying attention out in those environments, I think it's imperative, again, if you're truly community minded, that you're going to start developing these skills, pulling these things together and learning how can I be a better asset to both my family and to those that I trust and that I'm trying to build this community with. Because, and it's an old saying, but it's true. You know, you're only as strong as your weakest link. All right. So it should be the desire of every single individual to continue developing skills and learning more where they can and creating more and just in general trying to better themselves. And I can do a little shameless self-plug here, but that's the reason that we're trying to do Millstone over on Mark's channel. And I'm sure some of you guys have heard that and stuff, is because, again, it's that community preparedness. And whether it's from kinetic knowledge, when you're talking about using a firearm, to gardening, to, you know, in general, just even conversation, having that community development skills and going about these things. It's important that we all try to continue to hone our words first and foremost,
Right.
because that's the most effective weapon that we all have is our language. It's how we communicate ourselves, convey ourselves. It's why everybody should be very careful in the words that they pick. And how do we develop our skills? And how do we continue to become a more dangerous individual? And I mean dangerous individual in the sense of like truly capable of doing these things, having the knowledge, the understanding of how to,
Mhm.
but like as the Christian ethos is having that sharp sword, but keeping it sheathed. All right.
Yep.
You want to talk about a free man, a true freedom minded individual, liberty based person. Well,
Mhm.
what is it? It's an exceedingly dangerous individual
Yes.
capable of extreme violence that keeps that under wraps in a community and protects those that they love. I mean, that really is what it is, because you cannot be free. It's like a pacifist. I cannot stand the concept of pacifism, because pacifism cannot exist without the willingness of good men to do extreme violence.
Hmm.
So it is, I mean, I guess it all boils down to it. And we know a lot of people personally, I know that lived this, but you want to be a sheepdog or do you want to be a wolf? Because you don't
Yeah.
want to be a sheep. And I think if you really do want to be a free, liberty-based individual, you got to be a sheepdog.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. And, and I think, I think to that, and you made a lot of really good points, Blake. Um, I think there's something to be said that as individuals, and I want to bring it back to an individual level too, because we as individuals can either add or detract from our communities, right? And we've talked about that on and off as a theme, I think, throughout this. But we need to get back to not only ourselves, having introspection, evaluating ourselves, but when men become fathers and women become mothers, understanding how to live intentionally, to
Mhm.
understand intentionality in things that we do. And that intention, it brings this impetus of responsibility upon us. It's something that we choose to bear. And I think there's a lot to be said about that, because when you start to take on that responsibility, when you live intentionally, when you speak intentionally, when you act intentionally, when you have intention and purpose behind what it is that you do, you to some, not even to some degree, but you set up a set of principles, or you adhere yourself to a set of principles and standards and morals and virtue, and all of these things again are things that our founders had spoke on, because they were fundamental in doing what? They're fundamental in supporting liberty, because liberty is one of the greatest augmentations that we have as humankind, is the realization of liberty. Because what all of these things, they feed into liberty, but then liberty provides us, if you will, the ability to do all of these things. So if we support liberty, liberty supports us in the end. It's a cyclical thing. But as soon as we stop defending liberty, then what do we lose? We lose our by a very extreme way, we lose rights, we lose our ability to do things, we become debauched in our manners, we become immoral, we become non-virtuous, we lose our intention, we just go through our lives it almost in a way that is like a shell of our former selves, because we've essentially shed off these responsibilities and all of these things that make us great or potentially great. And so it really is kind of this chaotic cycle, but it's a cycle that I love to talk about, because when you realize the possibilities and the potential that comes with all of these things, and living intentionally and living with purpose, this is where you maximize the potential of humanity, in my opinion. And liberty is such a fundamental cornerstone. It's a fundamental building block to the best that humanity can be, that it can only be built up by an intentional community of people who live with purpose, who have standards, that have all of these fundamental things that make us the best that we are. And we can only do that when we bring people together that have that same goal, that have that same vision, that have the same mentality. So I love that. And I kind of wanted to bring that out to you because I know that's something that we've talked about too, is like having purpose, having intentionality, and having the drive to want to be better. And all of these things come out more and more in a liberty-oriented society. It supports liberty, and liberty in return supports us. So
right on, man. I mean, and I do agree. It should be the cornerstone of a healthy society.
Yeah.
It was at one point the cornerstone of our healthy society, and it's flickering, you know.
Like that no vacancy sign. It's still giving power to it, but it's a little rough.
Yeah. So it doesn't mean it's gone, you know. And I think that if we really want to truly see things get right, what is right, I should say, if we want to try to fix things, we have to do it in our communities. We have to do it on our local level, because one downfall of society is this little phone I'm staring in, the computer screen you're staring in, is we all think that we can fix the world, or we can all at least be heard by the world. I mean, look at us here. We're talking digitally. To an extent, there's some truth to that. But we have to look more locally than we do globally. Everybody wants to get their likes. Everybody wants to get their little dopamine hits from being recognized and all that kind of stuff. You know, you really, that's great, fun, awesome, do yourself, whatever. Don't really care. But if you really want to make a change, you got to do it locally with people that you know in the flesh and the blood. Right. And that maybe live near you, or family, or whatever it is. But if you really want to make a change, you do it on the local level. And eventually, maybe we can go bigger. Maybe a lot of other people are doing the same thing, and it can spread. But that's about the only way I know of, I've actually came up with, that actually has a fighting chance that doesn't involve a lot of people getting hurt. And that's the thing that scares me, is there's not a lot of great alternatives anymore, you know? So I'm kind of one of those batten down the hatches and try to get your family as prepared as possible and weather the storm kind of guys. And if you really want to weather the storm, because there's going to be at least some areas, I mean, well, what am I talking about? There's going to be, it's happening. You know, you've got a war between Russia and Ukraine. You've got the dust up down in Gaza. You've got this newest thing happening in Kashmir along the Pakistan and Indian border. You know, I mean, and we could talk and go on and on. Myanmar, about 2 years ago. So things get violent. That's human nature. And there are a plethora of examples in the real world that are happening right now. And if you're naive enough to say, well, I'm living here, I'm living there, it won't happen here. Well, holy crap.
Can't happen here.
Yeah, as I say, I got a bridge to sell you. Yeah. So don't think we're insulated from the extremes, all right? And get very, very comfortable with the idea that it's quite the opposite, and act accordingly. Sure. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And you know, honestly, I think this discussion, it really is a good precursor to, I think, everything in terms of like what the In Defense of Liberty series is what I'm hoping it's going to be about. Because at the core of everything that we do, whether it's, you know, like I've mentioned before, I'm part of the American Liberty Caucus, and so much of what they do is intentionally at the community level. They work within the states, they work within their communities. It's community issues that not only do they get more traction on, but it's more meaningful because it's people around you, it's people that you know, and eventually it trickles up higher, but you have to start from the ground up, because if you don't have good roots, if you don't have a good foundation, then everything else around it's either going to crack or perish. And so if it's you know, if it's something in terms of like you're trying to figure out what to do, start trying to find like-minded people in your community. If there's not an organization that's set up, be the person to start that organization, be the watchdog, get involved with your city council. I know, or your town council. I know a lot of people, they shriek at that or whatever the case is, but it's like you can do a lot of good by just being that one voice even if you don't, even if you get overruled, if you're the one voice that says no on something that could affect your children, something that could affect the community, something, you are the voice for the people that say no. You're the voice for the people that maybe are too afraid to say that, and we need more people being involved. You have to be willing to get into the fight and to be willing to put action to words. And I think that's so important, not only as an individual, but in preserving liberty at the individual and community level. It has to be done. And Blake, I have to thank you, because you've come on here, you've been able to share so much, and I really appreciate everything that you bring to the conversation. I have no doubt that as time goes on, we're going to have more and more conversations about community, because it's going to be so much more important. And I want to give a quick shout out to Sean Kennedy. Congratulations, brother, on winning your election. I know you're going to do great stuff in your community, and they should be really happy and proud to have somebody like you, being able to be in a position now to where you can at least be that objective voice, the voice of reason, the voice of saying no when things are not okay, and saying yes when there are good things in front of you. If you don't know who Sean is, he's the chair of the American Liberty Caucus. He's a really good dude. He was on the first episode, and I'm really happy to know him as a person too. And I'm hoping if I could figure it out, I can get both Sean and Blake on. And Blake's heard me talk about this, because I think those two guys will mesh so well. And I don't want to speak for Sean, but that's just my personal humble opinion. They're two amazing people. So Blake, any final thoughts, any closing thoughts that you want to add to this? Or you know what, even if I may, what is a hopeful message that I think we can put forth? Because it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all the worst case scenario, right? There is hope.
Yeah, there is hope. I actually think there's more hope now than there has been in a long time.
Yeah.
You got nowhere to look for it, though. And I would say that if you're out there and you're struggling to find it, is look towards the community, look towards your friends, your family, those you can rely on. I would say when you get up in the morning and things are hard, and trust me, that's how I get up every morning. So the advice that I'm giving right now, I'm giving more to myself than I'm giving to anybody else, is keep soldiering on. When you don't want to, do it. When, there's no one else to do it, pick it up and get it done. Yeah. When you're tired, figure it out. And at the end of the day, if you kind of keep on that path and you can keep pulling more people of that mindset together, well, things will get better. And I am hopeful. I really, really am for the future, because out of the chaos, rebirth can happen. Something really good could come to it. I'll be honest, so this is where I'm going to kind of put a little damper on that hope. Is in my lifetime, I hope so. But I truly do believe that in my children's lifetime, there will be good again. And that for that future generation, for those that come after us, at the very least, let's get it done now so it's better for them. And that was the mentality that built this nation.
Yes.
And as you said, pointing to World War II, and this is a conversation for another day, but I would tend to agree with you to a certain aspect. That probably was at least the birth of the proto-American Empire.
Sure.
Before that, we really did honestly try to leave something better for the next generation. If we get back to that ethos, if we try to actually educate again, we try to build again, and we try to make things that work and can grow, man, the sky's the limit. And even beyond the sky. I hate to say it, and I hate to say this cliche, the stars, and that's really the goal, right? Yeah. Do we want it to be a tyrannical system once we finally get off this planet, or do we want it to be a liberty-based system? I'd way rather go out among the cosmos as a good, honorable people than a bunch of shitbags, pardon my French. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's one of those things to where I can't help but feel like at the current juncture, we're going to finally make our way out there, and whatever life does exist out there, they're like, oh, well, there goes the neighborhood. These retards are coming out here and they're going to screw everything up.
Yeah. Well, and
So,
hey, so going back to real quick, a positive note, and I can
yeah.
honestly say that that was the very first dragonfly of the season I just saw fly
Oh,
right by me.
lovely.
So
That's lovely.
that is.
Well, if I can add just a little bit more to what you're saying, to kind of put a nice bow tie on this. The founders, they weren't perfect men, and there's founding mothers like Mercy Otis Warren, who's just one of many. They're amazing people in their own ways, and one thing they did understand, and Blake, I'm really happy that you talked about that hope mechanism, or the realm of hope in terms of our future and our posterity and our children, because our founders knew that liberty is not generational. It has to be perpetually fought for. And it's not something that you can just simply hand down like it's a watch or a fishing rod, or Papa's 30-30. It has to be fought for, and in the best and most effective way that we can do that. If we see like even a glimmer of it in our lifetime, we're going to be we're doing pretty good. But in the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's more for our future and our posterity. So if we can teach them right, if we can educate them, bring them up right to be a moral, virtuous people, to carry forth the important principles, not only are they going to be able to turn the tide, but they may be able to enjoy a realm of life that you and I have never and will never probably ever experience. And that, to me, that hope is the most important hope, in my opinion, because it's the hope that our future generations are going to be able to affect the change to where they get that quality of life. And I think that is the most hopeful outcome that we could ever ask for. You know, and I know some people, I think the knee-jerk reaction is like, well, I kind of want to, it'd be nice to experience some of it now. There's no guarantee right now, but we can affect the future. We absolutely can. And I think that's the important thing to focus on. So I totally agree with you, brother. I think it's for the children and for the posterity, and what an amazing thing it would be to know that there's a little less overreach, there's a little less tyranny, there's a little bit more liberty, and people are a little bit more virtuous and moral. You're already starting, future generations potentially on a better track to where they can continue to go in that direction, as long as they have the knowledge, the foresight, and the ability to affect that change. So, that being said, I appreciate you, man, and I thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to come on here to discuss community, to share kind of your thoughts and your positions and how they've evolved and how they've changed, becoming a business owner, becoming a father, and really being able to evaluate, how community and liberty kind of intertwine and how they affect each other. Because I think it is at its core the most fundamental basis for sustaining liberty and weathering any storm that comes our way. So thank you very much. And if you have a little bit of time, I would love to talk to you a little bit more after the live here. So
Yeah, I got a few, but then I gotta go feed the little man
yeah,
because he's gonna be
right on,
wanting
brother.
some nourishment. So,
Right on. So, all right.
well,
Well,
thanks for
hey,
having me, man. It's
yeah.
been a blast. I really do appreciate it. So, and I do look forward to getting back on at some point if you want me on back again.
Oh,
So,
dude, I would love to have you on,
great.
100%. And look, I gotta say thank you so much to everybody who has come on, who's watched, who likes, and if you like what you see, you subscribe, and if you share it, that's even better. It really does mean a lot, because I think the more voices we have out there that are talking about liberty, the better off we are. And that's not just me, it's not just Blake, it's all of you. And we are all a part of this big community, and we're all a part of this situation that requires our involvement. And so it does start with you as much as it starts with us. So thank you for joining us on Sentinels of Liberty. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you not only on our regular episodes, but on the new series, In Defense of Liberty. I'm hoping to have some really good content here that's a little bit different from the general episodes. And if you like it, let me know. If you don't like it, also let me know. And feel free to, again, throw a subscription in there, And probably wouldn't hurt to hit the notification bell because YouTube's not very good at that. But as always, go with liberty, be good to people, and help just help your community and be a fundamental part of your community. We really need to pull together on this. So have a great evening. Blake, thank you very much. And thank you to all of our viewers. Good night and God bless.